My body belongs to me. Don't expect anything else. Ethan's words cut through the dim light of our bedroom, colder than the February wind rattling against the windows of our New Orleans apartment. I froze, still standing there in the lace slip I had nervously chosen for our 2-month anniversary, my heart pounding with both hope and dread. For weeks I had told myself he was just tired, that he was adjusting to marriage, that maybe I was pushing too hard. But tonight, hearing those words from the man I had promised my forever to it, felt like someone had ripped the floor out from under me. My name is Clara Bennett. I'm 29 years old, a book editor who has always believed in love stories, the kind that build slowly, carefully, and end in quiet devotion. That belief shattered the night my husband looked me in the eyes and treated me like a stranger trespassing in his bed. The irony stung sharper because Ethan Montgomery was not just anyone. He was the man who had once walked across the quad at Tulane University, with that easy smile, the boy who flirted shamelessly, the one I secretly admired but ultimately exposed when I caught him cheating on a law exam. I told myself I did the right thing back then. He was reckless, arrogant, and I believed the world would be better if he were forced to face consequences. But sitting in that bedroom all these years later, watching him pull away as though I carried poison on my skin, I wondered if I had doomed myself. Had my small act of righteousness created this distance, this cold revenge he now carried into our marriage? Ethan didn't shout. He didn't need to. His indifference was more violent than any raised voice could be. He turned his back, the glow of his phone reflecting on his face, his lips curving into a faint smirk as though he had won some private game. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to claw through whatever wall he had built between us, but the words lodged in my throat like stones. Instead, I whispered, "We're married." Don't I deserve to understand? He didn't even flinch, just the shrug of his shoulders, the deliberate coldness in his voice as he said, "Marriage doesn't mean ownership. You should remember that." And then he walked out, leaving me in a silence so heavy it pressed against my chest until I could barely breathe. In that silence, my mind spun back to the whirlwind months before the wedding. Ethan had been magnetic, attentive, almost desperate to win my heart. He remembered the smallest details about my favorite authors. He made me laugh when work buried me in deadlines he promised he had changed. And maybe because I still carried the guilt of my old betrayal, I let myself believe him. I let myself forget that the boy I exposed years ago might still live inside the man I married. But now, in the hush of our bedroom, I felt the truth clawing at me. This wasn't about boundaries. It was about power. And I had just stepped into a game I didn't even know I was playing. The next morning, the kitchen smelled of coffee, but it did nothing to soften the knot in my stomach. Ethan moved around with the same precise motions he always had, mug placed exactly on the counter's edge, phone in hand, thumb scrolling eyes, never truly on me. I sat at the table, my fingers tracing the rim of my untouched cup. I watched the way he checked his watch twice in less than a minute, the way his jaw flexed when the phone buzzed, and he stepped quickly toward the balcony to answer. Through the glass, I saw his face come alive, in a way it never did with me. His lips curling into a smile, his voice lowering into something soft, almost tender. My heart twisted. That smile used to belong to me, or at least I thought it had. I remembered when he couldn't bear to let a single business trip separate us. Back then, he would text me late into the night saying he missed my laugh, my smell, the warmth of my hand in his. Now my absence seemed to bring him relief. When I told him over breakfast that I might visit my cousin in Baton Rouge for the weekend, his spoon froze for half a second before he nodded quickly and said, "That sounds nice." "How long will you be gone?" Not even a flicker of hesitation, not even a hint of sadness. Just calculation, like my leaving was a piece of a puzzle falling into place. I tried to smile, tried to pretend I was casual, but inside I was unraveling. The walls of our apartment, once a sanctuary filled with stacks of books and little notes he used to leave me. Dinner tonight scribbled on a post-it. Don't forget to smile taped to the mirror now felt sterile. He had cleared the counters of clutter, rearranged the shelves with mechanical neatness, as if he were scrubbing me out of the space. Even the air smelled different, colder like detergent masking something rotting underneath. That afternoon, when he claimed to have a meeting downtown, I wandered into his office. The room was too clean, unnaturally clean, as if no one actually worked there. Drawers held only pens aligned like soldiers, a single legal pad without a mark, a filing cabinet filled with blank dividers, but the trash bin betrayed him. Half buried under shredded envelopes lay a receipt from a property management firm in Houston. The date was only 2 weeks ago, the signature his. My throat tightened. Houston was not where he told me he'd been. And next to the receipt, scrawled on the back, a phone number with a Texas area code. My hand trembled as I slipped it into my pocket. By the time he returned that evening, I had convinced myself to play my part. I smiled when he walked in, kissed his cheek lightly, though my lips felt like stone, and asked about his clients. He offered vague phrases, confidential, sensitive, can't discuss, and his green eyes flicked away just a moment too quickly. I laughed softly, pretending not to notice, but inside I was cataloging every twitch of his mouth, every careful word. That night in bed I lay still, pretending to drift off while his breathing grew shallow beside me. When I heard the faint click of his phone, I turned slightly and saw the glow of the screen reflected in his eyes. He typed quickly, his expression softening in a way I hadn't seen in months. I wanted to snatch the phone out of his hands, demand to know who he was writing to, but I kept still, my nails digging crescents into my palm. The silence between us was no longer just absence. It was full alive, crowded with secrets I wasn't supposed to see. And yet some part of me couldn't let go of the memory of the boy. He had been the one who used to walk me home after night classes, who once told me he envied my sense of purpose. I had destroyed that image when I turned him in for cheating. But had I also created this man, the one lying inches away, breathing evenly as if he carried no guilt at all? My chest ached with the question, but I swallowed it down, staring at the ceiling in the darkness. Tomorrow, I told myself, I would stop pretending. Tomorrow I would begin to find out who Ethan Montgomery really was. The morning light spilled across the kitchen tiles, but it did nothing to thaw the chill that had settled into me. Ethan was already dressed, navy suit tie knotted with practiced precision, coffee mug in hand. He kissed the top of my head as though nothing had happened, as though we were the picture of a normal couple. For a fleeting second I almost leaned into it, almost let myself believe in the performance. But then he grabbed his briefcase and said, "Client meeting, don't wait up," and the lie was so effortless it made my stomach twist. When the door shut behind him, I stood in the quiet, my heart hammering so loudly I thought the neighbors might hear. This was the moment. Pretending ignorance had gotten me nowhere, and every instinct screamed that the man I married was hiding a truth darker than I could imagine. My hands shook as I approached his office again. The scent of his cologne still lingered in the room, sharp and calculated like everything about him. I turned on his laptop, but the password prompt blinked back at me like a taunt. I tried birthdays, our anniversary, even the name of his mother he once mentioned in passing, but nothing. My palms were damp when I finally gave up, slamming the lid shut harder than I intended. That's when I noticed the corner of a manila folder sticking out from under the rug near the desk. He must have dropped it without realizing. Inside were photocopies of property deeds, all in Houston, all bearing his name alongside someone else's, Mason Reed. The name was unfamiliar, but the way Ethan had hidden it spoke volumes. The longer I stared, the more bile rose in my throat. My life was being rearranged on paper like I was just a signature, a pawn. I took photos of every page with trembling hands, my pulse racing each time the elevator groaned in the hallway outside our apartment. By the time I tucked the folder back under the rug, my entire body felt wired like I had swallowed electricity. When Ethan returned that night, his mood was unnervingly light. He hummed while he loosened his tie, asked me about my day with casual indifference. I tried to match his tone, forcing my lips into a smile, forcing my voice to stay steady, but the words tasted bitter. "Maybe we should see a counselor," I suggested, carefully watching his reaction. For a split second his smile faltered, his eyes narrowing just enough for me to see the panic flicker there before he smoothed it over. We don't need a counselor. We just need time. Don't you trust me? The question landed like a knife, sharp and deliberate, meant to wound. I didn't answer. I couldn't, because trust was the one thing already dead between us, buried under secrets and receipts and names I wasn't supposed to know. I lay awake that night listening to his even breathing beside me, and for the first time I understood Ethan wasn't avoiding intimacy out of caution or personal boundaries. He was protecting himself. He was building walls not against me but against discovery. And as I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling while the shadows crept across the walls, I made a promise to myself. I wasn't going to be his silent victim. I was going to dig deeper no matter what I found, no matter how much it hurt. Because the truth was already here, pulsing just beneath the surface, waiting for me to rip it open. The following day at work, I found myself staring at manuscripts without seeing a single word. The sentences blurred into meaningless lines of ink, while my mind kept replaying Ethan's voice, smooth and rehearsed, telling me to trust him. The office smelled of coffee and printer ink, a place that usually calmed me, but now even the familiar hum of keyboards grated against my nerves. Every vibration of my phone in my pocket made me flinch, expecting it to be him checking up, catching me in my own thoughts. By lunchtime, I couldn't keep it inside any longer. I dialed Rachel's number, my best friend and colleague, the only person who had watched me fall into this marriage so quickly and had dared to question it. Her voice was warm, grounding when she picked up. "Clara, you sound like you're about to cry. What's going on?" I swallowed hard, glancing around the break room to make sure no one else was listening. "It's Ethan," I whispered. "Something's wrong. He's not who he says he. Island I found. Documents. Receipts. Another name. Mason Reed. And he avoids me, Rachel. He hasn't touched me since the wedding. He smiles at his phone, but not at me." My words tumbled out too fast, breaking apart under the weight of my own fear. There was a long pause on the other end. Then Rachel sighed, the kind of sigh that carried both love and frustration. "I've been afraid of this. You need help, Clara. Real help. I know someone, Nathan Cole. He's an investigative journalist. If Ethan's hiding something, Nathan can find it." The thought of dragging a stranger into my private disaster made my stomach tighten, but what choice did I have? Every day with Ethan felt like living inside a glass house, beautiful on the outside, but one wrong step from shattering. That evening, I agreed to meet Nathan in a small cafe off Magazine Street. The place smelled of roasted beans and cinnamon, but I barely tasted the latte Rachel ordered for me. Nathan arrived 10 minutes later, a man in his early 40s with tired eyes that looked like they had seen too much. He didn't waste time with small talk. "Rachel told me your husband might not be who he claims. Tell me everything from the beginning." His voice was steady, almost clinical, but not unkind. As I spoke, laying out the timeline, the sudden distance, the receipt from Houston, the folder with Mason's name, Nathan's expression darkened. He scribbled notes in a small, leather-bound book, occasionally tapping his pen against the page, like he was fitting puzzle pieces together. When I finished, my hands were shaking so badly I had to grip the edge of the table to steady them. Nathan leaned back, his gaze cutting into me. "This isn't just marital trouble, Clara. It smells like fraud. Property deals, hidden partners, secrecy about his job. Men like Ethan don't marry for love. They marry for leverage. If Mason is his partner, then you're not his wife, you're his asset." The word asset sent a chill through me. I wasn't a person to Ethan. I was a key, a bridge to something he wanted. My chest tightened with both rage and shame, the kind that makes you want to scream and collapse at the same time. Nathan slid a card across the table. "If you really want to know the truth, I'll dig. But you need to be prepared. Once we start, there's no going back. Secrets like this, they rot everything they touch." I tucked the card into my purse, my pulse hammering in my ears. Walking back to my apartment later that night, the streets of New Orleans pulsed with music and laughter, brass notes drifting from a corner bar, couples holding hands under the glow of street lamps. To anyone else, it was a city alive with romance. To me, it was a stage set against the hollow echo of my own marriage. And as I climbed the stairs to the apartment I shared with a man who wasn't really mine, I felt the weight of Nathan's words press against my ribs like a warning I was living with someone who saw me, not as a partner but as prey. Nathan didn't waste time once. I agreed to let him dig. The very next evening he called me from a number I didn't recognize and told me to meet him in a parking garage downtown. My hand shook as I steered my car through the dim concrete level's headlights, flashing against oil-stained walls. I felt like I was stepping into one of his articles, a story about corruption and deception, except this time I was the headline. He was waiting near the stairwell leather notebook tucked under his arm, a small camera bag slung over his shoulder. "I checked the number on that receipt you found," he said without preamble. "It belongs to a property firm in Houston, and Mason Reed. He's listed as co-owner with Ethan on at least 3 shell companies. Paper trails don't lie, Clara. They're building something and you're part of their scaffolding." I gripped the strap of my purse until my knuckles went white. But why me? Why marry me? The words broke out harsher than I intended, raw with confusion. Nathan's eyes softened, though his tone stayed sharp. "Because you're valuable. The trust fund from your grandmother, the publishing shares, those are doors they can't open without you. Ethan doesn't need a wife, he needs a key. And you were it." The words felt like acid burning through whatever fragile illusions I'd been clinging to. I wanted to cry, but my tears had run dry weeks ago. What filled me now was something heavier, darker, a slow, simmering rage that wrapped around my ribs like iron. Nathan pulled out a small recorder and slid it toward me. "Louisiana is a one-party consent state. If Ethan says anything incriminating to you, this will capture it. But be careful. Men like him calculating cold, they'll sniff out fear." That night, back in our apartment, I tucked the recorder into the pocket of my robe. Ethan was in his office door, half-closed voice, low but animated as he spoke on the phone. I crept close enough to hear him laugh, a warm, intimate sound I hadn't heard directed at me in months. "Yeah, Mason, it's moving faster than we thought. She's restless, but that works for us. By the time she pulls the plug, we'll have everything lined up." My breath caught in my throat. Every syllable confirmed Nathan's suspicions. I backed away before he noticed the recorder heavy against my hip, like a weapon I wasn't sure I could wield. Later, lying in bed beside him, I studied the lines of his face in the shadows. He looked peaceful, innocent, even lashes brushing against his cheek, as though he had never lied, never plotted, never twisted love into a trap. I wanted to shake him awake, to scream the truth into his face, but I kept still. Instead, I pressed my hand to the mattress between us, feeling the cold space he insisted on keeping, and swore I would fill it, not with his indifference, but with evidence. The next few days blurred into a cycle of pretending. I laughed at his empty jokes, nodded when he gave vague explanations about late nights, kissed his cheek on cue. But behind my calm smile, I was memorizing. Every phone call he took on the balcony, every sudden trip to Houston, every document that passed through his briefcase. Nathan and I traded updates in hushed conversations, piecing together a map of Ethan's deception. The more I learned, the more the world tilted. Ethan wasn't just a husband with secrets, he was a predator who had chosen me carefully the way a hunter stalks prey. And every time he brushed past me without touching, every time his eyes flicked over me like I was furniture, I felt the truth pressing closer. This wasn't a marriage. It was a setup. And unless I fought back, I was already lost. The first time I pressed record while Ethan was in the room, my palms were slick with sweat. The tiny device was hidden in the pocket of my cardigan. Its red light invisible, but in my mind it glowed like a flare. Ethan was seated across from me at the dining table, scrolling his phone with the same detachment that had become his armor. I forced my voice into a soft tremor rehearsed in my head a dozen times. "Ethan, do you think we rushed into this?" His eyes flicked up green and sharp, then narrowed as if weighing how much truth he could afford me. "You worry too much, Clara. Marriage takes adjustment, that's all." He reached for his glass of wine, swirling it slowly. "Why are you planning to leave already?" The way he said it, half a joke, half a challenge, made my stomach twist. I bit down on my tongue before I answered, letting a pause linger, then whispered, I don't want to be a mistake for you. For the briefest second, his lips curled into that cold smile I was learning to hate. Oh, believe me, you're not a mistake. You're exactly what I need. The recorder hummed silently in my pocket, capturing every poisoned syllable. Later, when I met Nathan in his cramped office above a corner bookstore, I played the audio back. His brows shot up as the words filled the space between us. Exactly what I need, Nathan repeated, jotting it down. That's intent. That's him admitting you're a means to an end. I rubbed my arms against the chill that swept over me. It's not enough, is it? Not yet, he admitted, leaning back in his chair. But it's a start. We need him on record tying Mason into this, and we need documents. Financials, contracts, anything that proves they're using your marriage as cover. The thought of pushing further made my pulse race. Every night with Ethan already felt like tiptoeing across glass. But the alternative, doing nothing, was worse. The next evening, I set the stage. Candlelight pasta simmering on the stove, the kind of domestic normalcy he rarely questioned. Ethan came home in a good mood, whistling faintly as he hung up his jacket. Over dinner, I leaned forward, feigning nervous curiosity. I saw a number from Houston on our phone bill. Are you working with someone there? His fork paused midair. For an instant, panic flickered across his face, then he gave a tight laugh. I told you I have partners. Mason helps manage some accounts. It's complicated, but you don't need to worry about it. Mason, I echoed softly, as though tasting the name for the first time. Is he why you've been gone so much? Why you've been so distant? His gaze hardened, a warning flashing in those green eyes. Clara, don't dig where you don't belong. It'll only hurt you. My chest clenched, but I forced myself to drop my eyes to let the silence stretch until he turned back to his food. Inside, though, I was on fire. The recorder hidden under the tablecloth was still running, and with every bite he took, I felt my strength return. That night, after he drifted off to sleep, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. My fear hadn't vanished, but it had changed shape. It was no longer the fear of being abandoned or unloved. It was the fear of what he might do once he realized I was no longer his passive, pliant wife. But alongside that fear was something else, something sharper, the taste of victory still far away but within reach. For the first time since Ethan had whispered vows under the oaks of our wedding, I felt the shift of power, and I knew I wasn't done pretending. The best lies were the ones told with a steady smile, and I was ready to give him one he would never forget. Nathan spread a series of documents across the desk, the lamplight catching the edges of the papers like they were blades. I leaned closer, my pulse racing as he walked me through the plan. He wants access to your assets, right? We let him believe he's close. We give him just enough rope to hang himself. His tone was calm, but his eyes carried the weight of someone who knew how dangerous men like Ethan could be. The pages detailed a mock transfer agreement carefully worded, designed to look like the preliminary step of shifting part of my grandmother's trust fund into an investment account. It was all bait, every line meant to entice him to confirm his intent. All you have to do, Nathan said, is put this where he can find it. He'll do the rest. A man like Ethan won't be able to resist. I stared at the papers, my stomach tightening. It felt like handing him a loaded weapon and daring him to pull the trigger. And if he suspects, I asked, my voice trembling despite my effort to sound steady. Then he shows his hand faster, Nathan replied. But Clara, you have to be careful. You're living with him. If he senses anything off, he won't just walk away. He'll double down. That night, I tucked the mock agreement into a folder and slid it halfway into the drawer of Ethan's desk as though I had hidden it in a rush and forgotten. Then I sat on the couch with a book I couldn't read, heart pounding in my ears, waiting for the sound of the key turning in the door. When Ethan came home, his mood was lighter than I'd seen in weeks. He kissed my forehead absent-mindedly, poured himself a drink, and wandered into his office. I kept my eyes fixed on the page in front of me, but my body tensed at the faint creak of the desk drawer. Silence stretched for a beat too long. Then came the sound of papers shuffling, followed by a low chuckle. "Interesting," he muttered to himself, just loud enough for me to hear. My chest constricted. He'd taken the bait. For the rest of the evening he was oddly attentive, asking about my day, making a joke about cooking dinner together sometime soon, even brushing his hand against mine as he passed me in the kitchen. The sudden warmth made my skin crawl. It wasn't love. It was performance, a mask he thought I was still too naive to see through. Later, when he fell asleep, I stepped quietly into the bathroom and dialed Nathan. My whisper was barely audible over the rushing tap. He found it. He's biting. Nathan's voice was grim but steady. "Good, now we wait. He'll push for signatures, maybe bring Mason into the picture. When he does, we'll be ready." I hung up and stared at my reflection in the mirror. My face looked pale, my eyes too wide, a woman stretched thin by lies. But beneath the exhaustion, I saw something harder taking root. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was leading him step by step into his own trap. Still, as I crawled back into bed beside him, listening to the even rhythm of his breathing, the fear was a living thing inside me, because I knew Ethan calculating, vindictive, patient. And the moment he realized I wasn't the clueless wife he believed me to be, the game would turn deadly. 3 nights after Ethan found the mock agreement, his patience cracked. He came home late, his tie loose, the smell of whiskey clinging to him. He sat across from me at the dining table, no phone in his hand this time, no mask of indifference. His eyes gleamed with something sharper. "I saw the paperwork," he said, casually swirling the ice in his glass. "You should have told me. Those trust fund assets, you've been thinking of moving them, haven't you?" I forced my voice steady, though my heart hammered so loudly it made my ribs ache. "I wasn't sure yet." It felt overwhelming. He leaned forward, his smile tight. "You don't have to be overwhelmed, Clara. You have me, and I have someone who can help. A partner." He paused, letting the word hang in the air like bait. "Mason Reed. Brilliant guy. He handles complicated transfers like this all the time." Hearing the name fall from his lips made my skin crawl. He was testing me, watching my reaction, daring me to question. I lowered my gaze to my lap, pretending uncertainty, while my nails dug crescents into my palms. "I don't know, Ethan. It feels risky." He chuckled softly, but there was no warmth in the sound. "That's marriage, sweetheart. Risk. Trust. You married me because you believed in that, didn't you?" His words were a blade wrapped in velvet, slicing at my guilt from years ago, the memory of exposing him in college. The next day, Mason appeared. He was taller than I expected, with thinning blonde hair and a smile that never reached his eyes. He shook my hand firmly in our living room, his palm clammy, his gaze lingering just a second too long. "Pleasure to finally meet you, Clara. Ethan's told me all about you. You're lucky to have him. Lucky." The word rang hollow, but I nodded and smiled, playing my part. They spread papers across the coffee table, pages of legalese and financial jargon that blurred together. I listened as Mason explained, his voice oily, while Ethan watched me with that same predator's calm. "Just sign here," Mason said smoothly, tapping a line at the bottom of one document. "This is preliminary. Nothing binding yet, just to show intent." My pen hovered over the page, the weight of both men's eyes pressing into me. Inside, my chest was on fire. The recorder sewn into my jacket pocket was running, every word etched into its memory. My hand trembled, and I let it, knowing it would look like nerves instead of resistance. "I'll need time," I whispered, finally setting the pen down. "It's a lot to take in." For a moment, Ethan's jaw clenched, the mask threatening to slip. Then he laughed softly and patted my hand, the gesture rehearsed. "Of course, darling. Take your time. We'll revisit tomorrow." When they finally left the room, Mason carrying the folder of forged promises, I collapsed against the couch, my breath ragged. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and texted Nathan one word: proof. That night, lying beside Ethan, I couldn't close my eyes. Every brush of his arm against mine, felt like the shadow of a knife, and as he drifted into easy sleep, I stared into the dark, the weight of the recorder heavy against my chest. I had what we needed. But I also knew Ethan was growing impatient, and desperate men didn't just steal, they destroyed. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the apartment, every shift of Ethan's body beside me, sent jolts of panic through my veins. I kept imagining him rolling over, pulling back the covers, and finding the recorder still tucked inside my jacket. But morning came, and he rose as though nothing were wrong, whistling softly as he tied his tie. The sound was almost cheerful, and that was somehow worse. It meant he thought victory was already his. As soon as the door shut behind him, I dialed Nathan with trembling fingers. My voice was barely more than a whisper. "I got it," he brought Mason. They tried to make me sign. Nathan exhaled slowly, the sound heavy in my ear. "Then we have enough to move. I'm handing the audio and documents to the state attorney. But Clara," his tone dropped sharp, "you need to be careful. They won't wait forever. Ethan will push again, and he won't accept hesitation a second time." The rest of the day blurred. At the office, I smiled when colleagues asked about the marriage, gave vague answers about being busy, but inside my chest was a thunderstorm. My phone buzzed constantly, Ethan texting little lines that looked affectionate but landed like shackles. "Miss you today. Thinking of you. We'll celebrate soon." Each message dripped with performance, with calculation, as if he were writing them for someone else's eyes. That evening, Nathan met me in his car 2 blocks from my apartment. The air smelled faintly of rain and gasoline, and my hands shook as I clutched the steering wheel. He passed me a thin folder. "Federal agents are on standby." "We let him try again. We need him reaching for the money, Clara. Once he does, they'll move." The folder contained copies of my trust documents, doctored harmless but convincing enough. Nathan's handwriting in the margins showed where to stall, where to feign confusion, where to let Ethan think he was leading me. "It won't be easy," Nathan warned. "You'll feel like you're about to drown. But you'll have to play it. Smile. Let him believe you're surrendering." That night, when Ethan returned, I forced myself into the role. I poured him a drink, kissed his cheek lightly, and slid the folder across the table. My voice shook, but I let it, knowing he would mistake it for weakness. I looked at the papers. Maybe you're right. Maybe this is best for us." The satisfaction on his face was immediate, chilling. He reached across the table, covering my hand with his squeezing just a little too tightly. "I knew you'd come around, Clara. I told Mason you just needed time. Tomorrow we'll make it official." My smile trembled, my stomach twisting, but I nodded. Inside, my thoughts screamed the recorder hidden beneath the tablecloth, capturing every word. Later, lying in bed, I stared into the darkness, Ethan's steady breathing filling the room. My body felt like stone, but my mind was fire, replaying Nathan's words. "We let him try again. Once he does, they'll move." It was almost over, but the closer the end came, the more dangerous it felt. Because now Ethan believed he had won, and there was nothing more terrifying than a man convinced his prey had stopped fighting. The next morning, Ethan was almost giddy, moving through the apartment with a lightness I hadn't seen since our honeymoon. He straightened his cufflinks in the mirror, humming as though the day ahead were nothing more than another business meeting. I watched him from the kitchen, forcing my face into a mask of fragile trust. Inside, my heart pounded so violently I could barely breathe. "We'll meet Mason at the bank at 2, he said, grabbing his briefcase. His voice was silk, but underneath I caught the steel edge of command. "Just sign Clara, and then we'll finally be free of all this stress. After today, everything changes." "Yes," I whispered, my throat dry. "After today." The hours crawled. I sat at my desk at work, hands trembling over the keyboard, pretending to edit manuscripts while my phone buzzed with coded updates from Nathan. "Agents in position. Stay calm." Each message steadied me, even as nausea curled in my stomach. At 1:50, Ethan picked me up in his car, Mason waiting in the back seat with a grin that made my skin crawl. "Big day," Mason said, clapping Ethan on the shoulder. "Clara, you must be relieved." "Relieved?" I almost laughed. Instead, I folded my hands in my lap and stared out the window as the city blurred by the courthouse dome gleaming in the distance. My body felt weightless, like I was drifting toward some irreversible fate. Inside the bank, everything smelled of polished wood and cold marble. Ethan guided me toward a private office where a notary waited. Papers spread across the desk, thick with legal jargon. Mason leaned over, pointing to the lines where I was supposed to sign. Ethan's hand brushed my back, gentle, possessive, a reminder that he thought he owned this moment. My pen hovered the air, heavy with silence. Then Ethan spoke, his voice low, urgent, almost triumphant. "Sign it, Clara. This is what we've been building toward. Trust me." I glanced up at him, and for the first time I let my mask slip. I let him see the flicker of fire in my eyes, the strength I had hidden. And as I pressed the pen down, the office door burst open. "Federal agents, step away from the table." The room exploded in chaos. Mason cursed, shoving back his chair. Ethan's face went pale disbelief, washing over him as two agents grabbed his arms, yanking him upright. The papers scattered to the floor like fallen leaves. "What the hell is this?" Ethan shouted, his voice cracking the charm gone, replaced by raw panic. "This is a mistake. She's my wife." But the recorder in my purse had already spoken louder than either of us. The agents read him his rights as he struggled, eyes darting to me with a mixture of fury and desperation. Mason tried to bolt, but another agent blocked his path, slamming him against the wall. I sat frozen, my hands gripping the edge of the chair, watching the man I had married unravel in front of me. For weeks I had lived in fear of this moment, but now that it was here, I felt calm, cold almost. Ethan's eyes found mine as they dragged him toward the door. "You did this," he spat, his voice trembling. "You think you've won. You ruined me, Clara." I held his gaze, steady, unflinching. "No, Ethan," I whispered, my voice steady for the first time in weeks. "You ruined yourself." The agents pulled him away, his protests echoing down the marble hallway until the sound vanished into silence. Mason followed, head bowed, his earlier grin twisted into defeat. And then it was just me alone in that sterile bank office, surrounded by papers that would never touch my trust fund, my inheritance, or my name. For the first time in months, I drew a full breath. The air felt clean, sharp, alive. The predator was gone, the game was over, and I was still standing. Weeks later, I sat in the wooden pews of the federal courtroom, the air heavy with the scent of old paper and polished floors. Ethan entered in shackles, his once perfect suit replaced by an orange jumpsuit. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an ally, but all he found was me, calm, composed, sitting straight-backed among strangers who had come to watch justice unfold. Mason shuffled in beside him, his face pale, the grin. I remembered now, completely erased. The prosecutor's words were measured, precise: conspiracy, fraud, identity theft. Each charge landed like a hammer, building a rhythm of truth that could no longer be denied. When the judge pronounced their sentences, 15 years for Ethan, 8 for Mason, I felt no triumph, no rush of vengeance. What I felt was release, as though chains I hadn't realized I was carrying slipped from my shoulders all at once. When Ethan turned to look at me one last time, his eyes weren't cold or mocking anymore. They were hollow, the gaze of a man who had built his entire life on deception and watched it collapse in a single afternoon. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply held his stare until he was led away, because I wanted him to know I was no longer the woman he had chosen as prey. Afterward, I walked out of the courthouse into the sunlight of New Orleans. The city was alive around me, streetcars rattling past, jazz floating from an open window, the scent of magnolia in the spring air. For the first time in months, the world didn't feel like a cage. It felt wide open, brimming with possibility. Rachel hugged me tight on the courthouse steps, her voice trembling with pride. Nathan stood nearby, his notebook closed at last, giving me a small nod of respect. I realized then that I hadn't just survived Ethan. I had dismantled him piece by piece, until the man who once controlled my every breath was nothing more than a name in a case file. Looking back, I don't regret the choices I made in college or the guilt that haunted me for years after. Ethan destroyed himself not because I exposed him, but because he could never stop hungering for more. And in the end, that hunger devoured him. My name is Clara Bennett. I am 29 years old. I was once a woman who thought she had found her fairy tale. Instead, I found myself trapped in a nightmare. But I learned that survival isn't about waiting for rescue, it's about trusting your instincts, standing your ground, and finding the courage to fight back. And I promise you this, I will never again mistake control for love or silence for peace.